now! Don't give it up, Lupe. Don't give it up, Solo. Don't give it up now, man. Don't give it up.
What's happening? This is William Craddock, Will to Win Gaming, back after a small break. I have been growing my org quite a bit recently, and I've been busy with our Patreon, traveling to events. But now I'm coming back. I've made some shakeups, so I'm more focused on YouTube. I'm more focused on me traveling to events, because first and foremost, as you know, I'm a tournament player, not a organizer or anything of that effect. First and foremost, I love to play tournaments, I love to travel, and I want to bring that information for free to my YouTube. So in today's video, we're going to be working on the 3 C's of deck building. I think this is really important, especially with 4.5 coming up. That's the 3 captain starter deck, and then OPO5 coming up right after that, just in time for nationals. So what are the 3 C's of deck building? They are concept, combos, and cards. I had to look at that last one. And what does this mean? Well, we'll get into it. First, let's talk about concept. So the concept is, what does your deck do? And here I'm using my classic DD Beard deck that I made for DD. And this is a red deck, so we're going to put it under one of the 3 archetypes, which is aggro. The other 2 being tempo and control, which we'll go over in a second. So the concept of my deck, or DD Beard, is to just be aggressive as possible, leveraging my 6k leader, and killing them as quick as possible by running out their hand with, vanillas, essentially. In One Piece, vanillas are very strong, and the reason is they take very little investment to make good attacks, right? 4 for 6k, 1 Dawn, now he attacks for 7k. 5 for a 6k rush, 1 Dawn, now he attacks for 7k. 7 for a 7k rush, no Dawn, he attacks for 7k. Kind of see a pattern here. So this is the first of the archetypes we're going to talk about in under concept. Aggro. Most red decks are going to fall into this just because that's what red does. Red just comes at you fast, comes at you hard, and tries to kill you. Next, we're going to move into what I would consider tempo. Trafalgar Law is probably the best example of a tempo deck, besides maybe Croc, but I think Trafalgar Law is just, a cut above the Croc deck in general. His ability, his deck, everything his deck does is just a little better. And why I don't put Law under aggro per se is because most of his cards kind of just don't do anything. A lot of Law's cards just spin the wheels. They have a lot of utility, a lot of searchers, because that's what Law does. But with his ability, in combination with his ability to pay 2 and play something that cost 5 for only 2 Dawn, that puts him in the realm of tempo. Because now he can play a lot of cards that don't do anything and use that 2 Dawn to put in a 5-drop, like Law. And Law just further accelerates this by returning a 1-drop such as Nami and playing a 3-drop such as 1 Year 2 Zoros. Now this isn't really important in the grand scheme of things. Talking about the Law deck, the Whitebeard deck. We're just talking about archetypes here. So Law would be a good example of tempo. I don't have a Croc deck set up currently, but Croc would be another good example of tempo. Now let's move on to control. Alright, now finally let's move on to control. Control, I think Queen is the first true control deck in One Piece. And what control is going to do is, essentially, if you look, Queen does nothing until the end stages of One Piece. One Piece can be a very quick game, but Queen really does nothing but spin its wheels for the first couple of turns. You're playing blockers, you're putting stuff on the bottom of the deck, and eventually you're playing threats. Now these threats tend to do double duty. Mihawk becomes a 9k for 9, but also puts something on bottom. Yamato generally doesn't clear something threatening, but it gains you a life. And Katakuri, kind of like a mini Mihawk, you can clear a threat, putting something on the bottom of their life, or you can put something on the bottom of your life. So it's, Katakuri is almost a cross between Mihawk and Yamato. You can kind of choose. Doesn't do quite as much as both, but it is very good. The effect is very good. So that's the difference between like an aggro deck, a control deck and a tempo deck. Now we need to go into the combos. Like, what are the combos or the synergies of a deck? Well, again, the first thing we should look at is Law. Law probably has the most synergies, as basically he has a leader ability that's a built-in synergy with his deck. Most decks don't do something like this. Law's leader ability, pay 2, returns anything, put something else of a different color into play that costs 5 or less. Alright, that's perfect. Because now the synergy is we can just play a bunch of cheap things. The average curve of this deck is very low, but allows us to play big things for 2 Dawn, which is actually kind of busted, right? Like, Law has a lot of design space issues in the future, but this is really gross. If we look at other decks, we'll look at DD Beard again. The synergy is essentially with the leader again, which is why I think Newgate's so strong. 6k starter, 6ks, 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 7ks. Like, all you're doing is being the synergy is with your leader because you're already this big baseline leader, and they're having to invest a lot of resources into attacking you. Given you also have 6 life, that just means you're going to have more resources over the course of the game. And this synergizes really well with things that drain resources from your opponent. Because you have the vanillas, this is always going to get 1 2k at the minimum from your opponent if you attack their leader. Or, 2 1ks, or if you put a Dawn under it, a 2k and a 1k, or it's going to take a life. Yasop, 8k base. So this is always going to get either, 2 cards or an event. If you put one Dawn under it, it's always going to get 2 cards. And one of them having to be an event, right? Like, it's just a synergy with the leader, just getting a bunch of cards and having big vanillas. Some other combos we have, or synergies, as I rather call them rather than combos. We got Zoro, of course. Zoro's leader ability, and you'll see, like, the top tiers for me. The top tier leaders are the ones with leader abilities that synergize well with the rest of the deck. So Zoro, along with, the weenie attackers, just making all your little small guys being able to attack for 5 and drain their resources constantly for minimal Dawn investment is what makes Zoro so strong. Oh, there's my Crapco deck. Katakuri is another one. So he doesn't have any built-in synergy as a... Oh, I guess he does. He has a little bit of built-in synergy as leaders. He lets you look at your life. Not as much as I would say levels of Whitebeard or Law. But you combo this with trigger characters, right? Like, I think Bandai's done a really good job of building synergies into leaders with the decks. Some of them just happen to be slightly overtuned. Alright, now let's go into cards. So specific cards to the deck, and this will be broken into subcategories, mainly consistency. So this is the reason I like things like Whitebeard. Whitebeard, to me, this is the most consistent version of Whitebeard and the most consistent deck in the format. Whitebeard's obviously very strong, but it's also very consistent. And what do I mean by that? Well, it kind of does the same thing every game because its card choice is redundant. It has 12 2Ks. So it always draws 2Ks, right? Almost always going to draw 2Ks. It has a searcher that has 30 targets, I believe. So 4, 6, 10, 14, 17, 21, 25, 29 targets. So your searcher is almost always going to hit, right? You play a Nami, the chance of you whiffing is very low. Maybe 1 out of every 30 games. I don't know. One of you math guys can do that. And you have a lot of redundancy. You have 6 of the same card. You have this 4 for 6 vanilla. You have this 5 for 6 rusher, which is almost the 4 for 6 vanilla, right? And then you have just a 6 for 8. You have a 5 for 6. You have a 7 for 7 rusher. They're all kind of like the same character. And you have a lot of them. And the good thing about this deck is you can play a deck like this just based on your leader ability. So we also have decks like Law. Law is obviously very strong, tier 1 deck, but it doesn't have the same consistency factor as Whitebeard does. You can play something like a Nami, but you only have, what, 4, 8, 11, can't find that, 14, 16, 18, 19? You have 19 hits, 20 with the guard point. So you have a lot of hits, but it's not the same consistency. Same with the Bonnie. You're just not going to have the same consistency as someone with 30 hits in their deck. Law makes up for this just by being strong, like his ridiculously strong leader ability. But if you've watched, I watched a match at Pasadena. Nikki Goldman, I believe, was on camera. Just drew all red cards, right? Like, and you can't do anything. If you play Law, if you draw all red cards, you're probably just dead. I think Zoro is another good example of this. Zoro, obviously, tier 1 deck, but it's got some inconsistencies. You have things like Buggy, which has 5, 8, 10, 11, 12 hits, right? So you're going to miss a Buggy. You have Izo. Again, just not as many hits as you'd want to make up for consistency. Like, if you high roll and you hit every time in a match, boom, like your deck's doing its thing and it's insane. But sometimes, you miss a Buggy than an Izo, you might just lose because of that. Zoro's pretty strong, so it's not likely you'll just lose for that, but that can happen, and this is the reason I put Zoro just like the slightest step behind Whitebeard is because of that reason. It's consistency reasons. But why is this all important? So now this is important because we need to look at deck building as a whole. And a lot of people are like, what makes a deck good? Why is how can I tell which list to use? And basically, I would say just look at these 3 basics. You want something that's consistent, right? If it's not consistent 100% of the time, you want something that's incredibly powerful. If it's not incredibly powerful and it's not consistent, you don't want to play it. It has to be one of those 2 things. And I choose to err on the side of consistency, given that the amount of tournaments I play. If you are someone who's going to play 1 tournament over the course of, a month or 2, you might choose something powerful just to look to spike that tournament. Some little deck building upgrades, I would say, some tweaks. Like, if you might find a list that you find is good. Like, I find this list solid, but you might tweak it. And this is DD Beard 1.5. Now, what do we do here? So for DD Beard 1.5, you notice we took out Winter Luffy's for Makinos. We took out a 4-drop for a Bartolomeo. So what do we do? And we took out an Ace for a Rush Luffy. So what do we actually do to the deck to change it? So what we did is we sacrificed some consistency because we took out some hits for Nami, but we added some power. And the power being an extra blocker, an extra aggressive threat towards the late game if it comes to that, and an extra Rush Luffy, which honestly, side note, the way the meta's going, I think this 4-2 split's good. But basically, we took the incredibly consistent deck and gave it just a slight nudge in the power stat for sacrifice a little consistency. And this is fine. You can make these small tweaks. Just don't make sure you overdo it, because that can ultimately change the whole scope of your deck, and that's not what you want. Now, if you want to look at some things that you've been looking at for 4.5, with the 4 Captains deck coming out, this is one of the decks I've been looking at. I've been working on it too hard. So this is probably a good example of something you might find on a website and be like, hey, I want to play that deck. That's cool. But to me, this deck is untested, unproven, and this may have won some 500-man tournament in Japan. All right, like you can see like a deck that won a 500-man tournament in Japan, but it may not be quite there. It may be a good deck, but it may be a 90% of the way their deck, and you can use the deck building basics to kind of make it the 100% deck and put it that, because like I said, this is a rough draft. If I was going to look at this, objectively, I saw this one in a big tournament, I'd be like, well, why'd they play Uta? Because Uta cost 8, and I'm sitting here, I'm Don -1, Don -1, Don -1. I may never reach 8 for Uta. Given it's a strong effect, I may never reach this amount of Don. And same with cards like this Law. This Law is obviously very strong on the front. This is coming in the starter 10 Captain decks. But it may not be what I want to do with my deck. This deck looks, on the front end, looks very aggressive. I've got Heats, which is a 3 for 6 most of the time. I've got Magellans. I've got some Jailer Beast. I want to put out bodies that go sideways. This may not be where I want to be, so I might cut down on the number of Laws. I might cut down the number of Utas. And look what else I have in here. Well, I only have 8 2Ks, and I have, what, 15 blockers. So I'm like, well, maybe I want to trim another one of these. So now I still have, what, 14 blockers, but I could put in another 2K. Have X-Drakes, have Sadie, but maybe I want to play Shiki, you know. Like, just to have another 2K. This is just be an example of something you can look at. Change it, and this tweaks the deck. It doesn't, like, really, the core base of the deck is still there. It just changes up the landscape a little bit, right? And this might be an example of something you do to tweak a deck that may not be perfect and take it from the 90 to 100%. I'm not, you know, obviously I'm just using this example. I wouldn't use this deck list, guys. I'd take a good look at it. If you want a Magellan deck, I'd probably look somewhere else. But this is just an example of how you might tweak a deck and how you might look at a deck and evaluate, like, well, I don't need 16 blockers. I'd rather have 12 2Ks and 12 blockers than 8 2Ks and 16 blockers. Because a 2K can just act as a blocker, right? If they're trying to attack for 6, trying to attack for 5, or trying to attack even for 7 on like a Magellan, a 2K can act as a blocker, but you don't have to play it, right? It's just free because it comes from your hand. And in the late game, if you had to, you can play an X-Drake. I wouldn't recommend playing Shiki, but hey, if you needed a body out there to beat down your opponent, a 2 for 3 could work. 4 Dawn, attacks for 7. Perfect. I think that's all we have for today. Be looking out for our OP05 videos, which are going to come out pretty soon. You know, we have a few tournaments coming up the next few weeks. We got an online this weekend that hopefully I can get into. We got Dallas next week. There's a PPG online next week also. And I think there's an event every weekend until the end of November, which is going to be great. If you're going to be in Dallas, make sure you come say hi. If you're going to be in Pasadena on the 11th, make sure you say hi to Keck, because I know he's going to be there with Cross. And yeah, that's the video. That's deck building. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below, and we'll see you later.